Let's talk about Moore v. Harper. And this is the big case that deals with the independent state legislature doctrine. Just tell us what who's Moore, who's Harper, and then this is really sort of very straightforward description of what's going on here. It is somebody just needs a dictionary on some level, or the originalists really should just do a little bit of history here. But tell us who Harper is in this case.
Moore is a Republican legislative leader in North Carolina. Harper is a voter in North Carolina who sued along with other voters after Moore helped to draw a very, very gerrymandered map for the state's congressional districts. The Republicans, as usual, controlled the North Carolina legislature. They drew an extremely biased map that gave them way more seats than they really deserved. And so these voters sued and said, look, this is a violation of the state constitution. We all know the Supreme Court has said that federal courts can't strike down partisan gerrymanders, right? But the Supreme Court in that same decision told us that state courts certainly had tools at their disposal under state constitutions to try to rein in partisan gerrymandering by themselves. So the North Carolina Supreme Court comes in and says, actually, you know what? Our Constitution goes way beyond the U.S. Constitution. We have this guarantee of free elections. We have these guarantees of freedom of association, of equal voting rights for all. We think that really extreme partisan gerrymanders violate the state constitution. So we're going to strike this one down. The legislature comes back and argues that, in fact, this is the part where we kind of go from like normal to Twilight Zone, argues that state legislatures are not obligated to abide by state constitutions or state courts when they are setting rules for federal elections. So state constitutions, which literally create state legislatures and explain how they make the laws, they cannot tell state legislatures, for instance, you're not allowed to draw an extreme partisan gerrymander. You're not allowed to throw out absentee ballots because of some pointless mistake. Think of all the various rules that govern elections. According to this argument, state legislatures have total control over that. State courts cannot step in. State constitutions are totally irrelevant. And so state legislatures basically get to rig federal elections every single cycle, and there's nothing that state courts can do to stop it.
And also governors. Governors have no power at all to intervene in this as well.
So there's various versions of this theory. There's like the maximalist theory, which is that governors can't intervene. And then there's the more modest theory, which I don't think is actually modest, which is that, well, governors can intervene, but state courts can't because of reasons that no one has been able to articulate. I mean, basically, it's just so radical to say that governors don't have control over lawmaking involving elections that the plaintiffs in this case, or the state legislature in this case, has tried to avoid that issue altogether.
Now, this is all derives from a reading of the U.S. Constitution that says, the Constitution says, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. And so And apparently there's another part of the Constitution that talks about how presidential elections also conducted by the legislature thereof. And so these people are taking that at not even face value, I guess, and saying this means that only the state House members, the Senate and the House or Assembly or however they call them, have power, not the rest of government in the state. And this is just simply a complete misreading of what that word meant at that time that it was written. There was no, the idea that in this unique situation, Congress, the federal government, would empower just one element of state government to do this one thing and can supersede even the state's constitution by empowering somebody else to do it is just, there's no precedent for this whatsoever.
No, there's truly no precedent. I mean, this is radical and literally unprecedented. And to debunk it, you simply have to go back to dictionaries from the 1780s and 1790s and look at how they defined legislature. Today, if you say legislature, sure, you might think about, the state house and state senate in the Capitol. But back then, that is not how the term was used, certainly not exclusively. The legislature was a term of art for the body that makes the laws within a government. It was not one particular organ of government. It was not one particular structured state house. It was the legislative power to create the laws that bind all citizens. And so this idea that when the Constitution says legislature, it really only means these particular state legislatures that we've set up, it's a totally anachronistic reading and very ahistorical. And just to give an analogy, there are a lot of places where the Constitution talks about what powers Congress has. Congress gets to do this, declare war, mint money, regulate commerce, whatever. Nobody says that excludes the president. Nobody says that excludes the federal courts. Nobody says that just because the Constitution talks about Congress alone has that power. It has always been understood that in the many places where the Constitution grants this power to a particular part of government, that it's just trying to grant that power to the lawmaking body that decides how a government is run. And that is just not a novel argument. The Supreme Court has been saying that for a decade. I mean, a century, and it has reaffirmed it in the last decade. And all that's changed since then is that a bunch of conservative justices have joined the court. But this is not an originalist claim that the Republicans are making here. This is an anachronistic claim that is simply designed to hand Republican-controlled state legislatures even more power over federal elections and federal redistricting.
Yeah, I mean, it really feels like saying, well, it says Congress, so you're a senator, not a congressperson. So, yeah, right?
Checkmate.
Yeah, checkmate.
Checkmate. I mean, or the president tries to veto it and Congress comes back and says, the Constitution says nothing about the president here. You don't get to do anything. This is all us, baby. That's just not how it works.
You would think if that was anticipated, there would be a notion of, without regard to, you would add a provision, without regard to the Constitution of the state, without regard to the governor's veto power, without regard to any other, prior law or referendum or anything like that. But it doesn't.
Right. Judges like to say that as a rule, lawmakers, ratifiers of the Constitution do not hide elephants in mouse holes, that usually a seemingly modest provision or normal provision is not hiding some kind of radical, expansive concept underneath the surface. And I think that applies here really well. Like, if the framers had wanted, in this one instance, I guess two, if you count the presidential elections and congressional elections, if the framers had wanted to exclude other parts of state government, they would have said something. You have to think they would have explained, either at the Constitutional Convention or in the document itself, that they were creating this very narrow rule that only applied in this context to state legislatures as a sort of institution of government. But they didn't do anything like that. And for the last 200 years, we've not functioned like that. We've always understood that, of course, state courts get to interpret state election law. That's like one of the basic rules of federalism. But now we are at a point where four justices disagree. And sadly, I mean, this case pretty much comes down to Amy Coney Barrett, which is never a good sign.
Has there ever been, in any writing or contemplation of the U.S. Constitution or subsequent to there, any place where this theory has been offered? Like, how recently developed is this theory that in this one instance, when we refer to government, there is a unique power that is associated with a specific cohort of government that exists nowhere else and at no other time except for now?
Right. So here's the one context in which this comes up. Contested House elections in the 1800s, where a state court announces the winner of the election to be person A, but the state legislature announces its belief that the winner is person B. Or the legislature and the courts announce different rules for voting or for counting votes, and those different processes create different winners. And then in that situation, the House has to decide, right? They have control over a contested election. election, they get to decide who wins. And what we see in some of those instances is that the party that really wants to seat a member of its own party who is favored by the state legislature, they have from time to time raised this argument and said, oh, well, the Constitution just says state legislature. It doesn't talk about state courts. So our guy should be seated because we believe that the state legislature has control here. But the very same people who say that will flip positions as soon as their guy is favored by the state courts instead of the state legislature. So if the guy in their party is picked by the state courts and the state legislature disagrees, they'll suddenly turn around and say, oh, no. Of course state courts have say over this. This has only ever been made as an argument from self-interest from sitting members of Congress who want to seat somebody of their own party. And even that has not been done since the 1800s. So this is not a historical pedigree that the Supreme Court should embrace or consider to be authentic or legitimate.
And again, it comes down to Amy Coney Barrett.
We know that Chief Justice John Roberts is not willing to go here. He held the line during the 2020 election when Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas tried to adopt this theory over the shadow docket, which would have been pretty crazy. Not even having oral arguments or like a case or anything, just saying on October 30th, 2020, that suddenly the independent state legislature theory was the law. Roberts held the line, and I think he will continue to hold the line in this case because, he's not as crazy, basically. He's not willing to totally rewrite the law of this country for a few cases that'll help Republicans. I don't know how Barrett will rule. This is really a test of her originalism, and I don't think she's a very good originalist. She's already deviated from originalist theory time and again when it favors Republicans, especially in voting rights and election cases. So I am not particularly optimistic that Barrett will see the light in this case. And I also don't think she's going to tip her hand during oral arguments because she tends to ask pretty cryptic questions. So we will see what happens. But again, when the future of democracy is in Amy Coney Barrett's hands, it's just not a good sign.
If you're the lawyer defending the idea that government, in the definition of legislature, at least in terms of the way that it was conceived at that time, is the government apparatus to generate laws and to critique laws and to constrain laws, right? That's what the Constitution does in the state, is it sets up the framework for laws. And so in some way it also develops laws insofar as it gives some type of parameters. Do you just come in with like 4 dictionaries from that time and just go like Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C, Exhibit D? Because their whole argument is based upon just this sort of like grade school reading of the words in there. And this just seems like, okay, show and tell time. Here's these dictionaries.
I think what's incredible is that the North Carolina Republicans who brought this case in the first place, who are arguing for this crazy theory, they cited 4 dictionaries from this period in their brief, and 3 of the 4 dictionaries go against them. 3 of the 4 dictionaries that they cite in trying to make this argument go against their theory and talk about a much broader conception of what the legislature is. They found some random dictionary from like New England in the 1800s that seemed to affirm their idea, but the vast body of authority here says otherwise. And what we've seen in this case quite remarkably, and I guess I should commend them, a lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives, lawyers, former judges, even some politicians have come to the Supreme Court through amicus briefs and said, do not do this. Do not go here. What North Carolina Republicans are asking for here is crazy and objectively wrong, and this will beclown the Supreme Court if they adopt this theory. The co-founder of the Federalist Society signed on to one of the meanest amicus briefs I have ever heard, basically saying that anyone who endorses this theory is a kooky idiot. When you have the co-founder of FedSoc saying that, you know something has gone wrong. So maybe Barrett will be amenable to those arguments. But again, I don't know. She's not a very consistent justice. And in the short term, at least, ruling for Republicans here will certainly be more helpful to Republicans than Democrats.
It could be an interesting biopic of that FedSoc guy at the end of this. Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer at Slate. Always a pleasure. Thanks for keeping us up on this.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks so much.